Hello comrades, it's the Finnish Bolshevik. So Badmouse did a video with Mexie where they talk about socialism and communism and stuff, and the fact that Badmouse is no longer an anarchist. This is not so much a response, because I don't really drastically disagree with what they were saying. This is more just my comments on a couple of things, because they raised a lot of important questions and a lot of important issues that I would like to give my thoughts on.
The thing is, when I became an anarchist, it was when it was basically I'd been flipping and flopping through ideologies for months on end, and I was trying to figure out which one. And libertarianism sounded really cool, so I was like, yeah, because it's all about liberty. And then when it was 2021, just obviously anarchism, I figured this sounds really cool because obviously you hear a lot about Stalin, Lenin, Mao, Ho Chi Minh, whatever, and then you're like, can't have that. So
that sounds scary.
Yes, that sounds scary. Yeah. and so I just figured, well, in that case, maybe anarchism is,
That is super interesting to hear because we often accuse anarchists of having this kind of mindset, and we often suspect that this is the case, that they choose anarchism because there's all this scary propaganda against, state socialism, if you want to call it. It seems that a lot of people who are anti-Leninist, let's say, I guess that's the most accurate, left communists, orthodox Marxists, Euro-communists, anarchists, Trotskyists, what have you, all these people, they make fairly similar arguments against Leninism. Now, of course, they have their own thing, but they have a certain commonality, which oftentimes we would call individualism. Now, in this case, we don't mean individualism in the exact same sense as right-wing individualism, which just glorifies the business owner and the individual, whatever. This kind of left individualism kind of makes itself felt as this extreme paranoia about hierarchy. They're very scared of hierarchy. They're very scared of strict organizational unity, organizational discipline.
But then the thing is, over time, I just sort of learned a little bit more about, Soviet Union, China, all that kind of stuff. And it's not necessarily I would support those things necessarily, but it's good to, I guess, know the historical circumstance in which it is.
Yeah. I think that's it. It's not really about I support them, because it's well, they were conducting an experiment in trying to apply Marxist theory to reality.
Yeah, exactly. It's not like a football team or something that you just support them for no reason. You want to learn from the successes, and you want to try to emulate the ones that you think fit your current circumstance, and of course you want to learn from the mistakes and try to improve upon those. There is also the propaganda aspect of it, which is that debunking anti-communist propaganda is not only because you want to learn, even though wanting to learn from the past is of course a big part of it, but that's not the entirety of the situation. The other part of this is that the anti-communists will try to paint these socialist experiments as terrible and as bad as possible. So there is this kind of propaganda aspect to it as well, which unfortunately makes it so much more difficult to learn, what actually was a success and what actually wasn't a success. It makes sense for us to try to defend the good things, because in that way we're also defending our own history, and also because we want to learn from what worked and what didn't.
The problem with anarchism, as I found it a lot of the time, is it is always it attaches itself to scenes.
When I was in university, I kind of got into the anarchist scene a little bit, because in anthropology we were talking a lot about punk kitchens, and so the punk scene was very tied up with the anarchist scene, and they did a good job of talking about ideology or whatever, but it really kind of was just a counterculture kind of punk way of being I don't support anything that's going on, so we're gonna do this over here. And I guess they kind of talked about it that was revolutionary in itself, but not that would actually lead to revolution or anything like that.
That kind of touches, in my opinion, the big question. I don't know, maybe this is just, again, the inner Stalinist in me and the inner Machiavelli in me, but what I think about is, I always think about how does this lead to the working class taking power. The tactical approach must be one that brings us closer to revolution by organizing people, recruiting activists, teaching people about ideology. If the tactics, and this applies to pre-configuration as well, if what you're doing means a real preparation for revolution, then it's good. But if it takes the shape of some kind of activity that is allegedly already revolutionary in itself, and it diverts people from actual revolution, then it's bad.
Like, correct kind of some people's thinking on like some of that stuff. So it's like, if this stuff is just plain historically inaccurate, then I'm like, okay, I totally see the point of being like, Stalin is actually kind of good, but like also bad, right?
Okay.
But like, it's just kind of like, you have to have the nuance, I guess. But so I understand like supporting and being like, okay, let's try and change people's minds. But in terms of tactics, like, no one's even gonna look at you.
No, exactly. That only like works to people who are already somewhat in the like leftist sphere a bit. Yeah.
Exactly what Badmouse said. This shouldn't come up unless you're a communist. Like, there's no reason to talk to random people on the street like about Stalin.
I was at this like grassroots protest against it was like some trade deal. I think it was the TPP or something. And there was like different groups there that were part of the protest, and one of them was Socialist Action. And people were even like, to the Socialist Action people who were not waving like communist flags. It was just kind of like, so we're socialists, but like, meaning like we're NDP, kind of like we're Labour Party, like, you know, we're not anything crazy. People were still just like, get a job, you like horrible. Like, they were just like, like really turned off by the word socialist.
I think we all agree that the solution is not to drop the word socialist, right? In this country, what the party that I'm in, the Communist Workers' Party, what we try to do is, a lot of times when we're in these demonstrations, like these bigger demonstrations against right-wing government policies, against the European Union, against NATO, against austerity measures and stuff like that. These demonstrations, they tend to be very liberal. Like, sometimes you see anarchists in there, but apart from that, it's very much liberal and social democratic and stuff. What we try to do is we go in there and we try to push it more to the left, and we try to radicalize it a bit more with our banners and with our stuff. There was a peace demonstration, like peace protest. We did our part in turning that into an anti-NATO protest. Somewhat successful, like, some people started chanting anti-NATO stuff, and we were the only people there who had anti-NATO banners. A lot of those demonstrations, they're just kind of spontaneous, and people they want to scream about how much they hate certain politicians and stuff, and we try to put forward more concrete demands, and we have banners that say, like, down with capitalism, replace capitalism with socialism. We don't shy away from using the word socialist. There's people who don't like it when we do that, but they tend to not say anything. And there really haven't been any negative consequences for what we try to do. But I think that this is kind of what Vanguardism is all about, that we realize that we're not a big party, but we can sort of have a bigger impact than a group of our size would otherwise have, because if we go into a demonstration or some kind of event, and everyone else is just saying like, oh, I wish the government would stop, like, being horrible, and then we go in there and we say, like, this is the situation, this is what's causing it, and this is what we need to do to move forward. That's what Vanguardism is about. You try to point the movement into a better direction. And I think we all agree that the answer is not to capitulate. We can't just get rid of the word socialist. I think it's just a matter of an ideological struggle at this point.
Kind of like something that I've also seen in the anarchist movement, which is, I guess, sort of what I'd maybe say a lack of motivation. In some sense, like, it's hard to push people. Like, I don't know if what I'm saying, I'm just blabbering, but I don't know, I just sort of found a lack of kind of, because everything is always like supposed to be non-hierarchical, completely horizontal, but in some circumstances that doesn't always work entirely. But then you get into the argument of, well, it's only justified by hierarchy, so sometimes it can be management stuff, but then at the same time,
that's a slippery slope.
It feels sometimes like a slippery slope. I mean,
justifiable hierarchy, well, like, as opposed to what? Like, as if Marxists just want lots and lots of unjustifiable hierarchy. Like, no, we think that this hierarchy that we have is justified, you know? Kind of a funny term, justified hierarchy. When it comes to motivation, I've noticed the same thing with, not specifically anarchist groups, but other kinds of small groups in general. Now, with anarchism, it might be worse because of the reasons that Badmouse said, but I've noticed that in a lot of small groups that are not really parties, they're just small groups that are very informal. They also have lots of problems because of how unorganized and unofficial it is, and kind of amateurish it is. If you have an actual party with an actual structure and stuff, it can still be flexible, and it's not like we walk around in NKVD uniforms all day and just like salute each other. Of course, it's more relaxed than that, but I think that if you have some kind of official structure, some kind of routine that's built around that, like what Badmouse said, like a management routine, it does make things run more smoothly. And also, if you elect or appoint somebody to a responsible post, that is a way of getting stuff done. Even if you ask for volunteers, then you still have the person actually being labeled responsible for this, then they get better at it. Humans don't like to go out of their comfort zone, so when you're asking people like, okay, who wants to do extra work, you might not get a lot of volunteers. There might be like the one guy who is always excited to do stuff, but not everyone is like that. But when you feel that it is your responsibility to do stuff, then you go along with it and you do it anyway. And then that builds up and becomes a routine. You get used to that.
It's equality. Everybody wants like a complete non-violent kind of a thing.
Yeah.
But then it's like, yeah, Finbull actually told me something. He told me, I can't remember exactly what he told me. I don't want to like bastardize this, but like what I understood from it was like, yeah, there's always going to be the tension between what's ideal and then like the opportunists or like the people who are going to try and like subvert that aim, or just like what can you actually practically do.
Yeah.
I know I promised Mexie that I would do a video on democratic centralism, and I still haven't done it, but I do want to do it. But the history of democratic centralism is a good example of what Mexie said, because it took on so many different kinds of forms, and Soviet policies in general, the goal was always the same. But there's always new kinds of problems that arise, and then you have to deal with those problems, which means that you have to change the way you do things all the time. They were hoping that the European Revolution would succeed, in which case things would have been very different, but then when they were the only ones that survived, they were like, okay, now we have to make certain kinds of changes to the way we do things to deal with the fact that we are now alone and that we are in the conditions of Russia. So, okay, now we gotta industrialize. This is a new problem. This was never discussed in Marx. We gotta deal with this. We got a lot of peasants, we gotta deal with that. Foreign invading armies, we gotta deal with that, so we gotta create a red army. All kinds of things like that. Like she said, it's not about seeking a middle ground, it's just that you want to figure out what is the goal and then how do we get there. The contradiction between this moment and then the end goal, that contradiction is going to be, of course, reasserted every single day, and every single day you're going to have to solve that contradiction by doing short-term policy, which is part of a long-term policy which would lead you to the end goal. So it's not seeking a middle ground, it's just seeking what can we do now to go forward. It's more about adapting to new problems as they come about.
There's a Reddit thread of like me with my Tumblr post about leaving anarchism, and someone like said to me some like quote from a famous anarchist, and it was like very, you know, telling you about sort of the ethics and the moralities of anarchism and stuff, and I just responded by saying, that's great, but when Franco's over the hill, they don't care.
Sometimes I feel like if people have expectations that everything is always going to be easy and go smoothly, and that everything is going to be just roses and unicorns and rainbows, I mean, I'm exaggerating, of course, but when people have those kinds of expectations, then of course they're going to be sorely disappointed. There's a fine line between being cynical and realistic to the useful degree, but also not being a giant pessimist. And I agree with what Mexie is saying, that no matter how difficult it is, it's worth a try. Like, you're not going to succeed if you're not going to try.
But then again, I can completely understand on the sort of vanguard side of things, people who would be against that, because I guess Marxist-Leninist theory or whatever is very, I don't know, you probably know more about it, but it's very sort of centered on this is the way we've got to go, and we need to do it because that's according to them, the only way it works.
Well, I don't know. And like, it's kind of like, I'm not like 100% up on my Marxist-Leninist theory, but like some people like Finbol or whatever has said that like it's actually very flexible, because like I kind of was asking people originally like, well, don't you think it's kind of like, don't you think that there would be a lot of variations around the world, like a one-size-fits-all thing wouldn't I don't think ever be practical or like something we should be striving for? And they were like, well, the ideology is actually very flexible, so you can apply it somewhere else. So I think it's just kind of like loosely like the vanguard idea, the party idea, and like democratic centralism. Right. But I think that's one of the main sticking points, and I might be wrong, so like I'm sorry if I'm completely wrong. But like I feel like I've heard some people say like, oh, anarchists are not my comrades, because when it comes down to it, like if you don't want democratic centralism, then we can't have a society or something, right? So
I like that. I love that thing you said, which was like, they may not be the comrades you like.
Yeah, they're the comrades you've got, guys.
Yeah.
Like,
Exactly.
Very good points were raised. There probably are people who say, like, you don't accept democratic centralism, they're not my comrade or whatnot, but, you know, I think that's ridiculous. Like, I do see anarchists as not comrades, but as potential comrades. Like, some anarchists are my comrades, while other anarchists are not. Even some Trotskyists, like, I do get along with some Trotskyists. But if you want to think about the ideological struggle between anarchists and Marxists, there is what I would say the psychological aspect, which is, are you in it for the working class, or are you in it because of individual liberty? That is a psychological, or maybe a philosophical difference. So there's that kind of philosophical debate, then there's the whole theoretical debate, what works better and all that. And then I think, unfortunately, this, to me at least, is actually the real reason for most of the fighting that goes on the internet, in real life. I think this is actually the reason why most of that happens. And it is that Marxist-Leninists, they attack anarchists, and anarchists get mad, anarchists attack Marxist-Leninists, Marxist-Leninists get mad, they attack, and this happens. But why does it happen? Well, in my personal experience at least, this happens because so much of anarchist propaganda and anarchist rhetoric is built around shitting on us, you know, it's built around shitting on Marxism-Leninism. If you look at the videos that I've done on anarchism, like, I've done a fair bit of anarcho-hating, you know, of hating on anarchists, and some people think like, oh, you despise anarchism, but no, I don't despise anarchism. I'm friends with some anarchists, and I think that there is enough commonality between anarchism and Marxism that we can have common goals and that we can work together. Not a problem. But, actually, I wrote something in my blog called, on the quote-unquote leftist critics of socialism or something along those lines. I'm gonna put it in the description, but that's kind of where I talk about this whole issue, how these anarchists and Trotskyists, their movement is almost like reverse parasitical on us. That sounds weird, but it's kind of like how Antifa is based on opposing Nazism. Anarchism, at least these days, to a big degree, it's built on hating Marxism-Leninism. I'm generalizing, whatever. I'm exaggerating. Of course, it's not entirely built around that. But if you look at the videos that I've responded to, I responded to Libertarian Socialist rants. Why? Do I just hate Libertarian Socialist rants? No. It is because he made a video where he was shitting on us, and he was saying like, Stalinist, red bureaucracy, blah blah blah. And everybody was saying how I need to respond to that. That's why I responded to him. Why did I reply to What is Anarchism? It's because What is Anarchism made a video where he was saying that the USSR was red fascist. That is why I responded to him. It's not because I hate him or I hate his ideology or whatnot. No, he was attacking us. All of my videos about anarchism have been inspired by that kind of stuff. Like, I wasn't even really thinking about anarchism at all until I started to see them going around hating on us. I made some videos where I talk about the problems that I have with anarchism. I made critiques of Makhno's Ukrainian Free Territory and the Spanish anarchist territory. But, the reason I made those critiques is not because I have some kind of hatred towards that idea. It's because people were saying that anarchism is just so flawless, and that's why we need to go with anarchism, and Marxism-Leninism just sucks. Long story short, in my opinion, anarchism is... And Badmouse, in what he said, he sort of confirms this, is that he thought that you can't be a Stalin supporter, you can't be a Ho Chi Minh supporter, so therefore you gotta go with anarchism. And that's kind of what the anarchists themselves have been pushing. They always start their recruiting by talking about how, like, wouldn't you like socialism? Yeah, sure you would, but we all know that Stalinism or whatnot is a failure. Therefore, fuck Marxism-Leninism, go with anarchism instead. The Trotskyist movement is entirely guilty of the same thing. I'm absolutely dead serious. Like, nobody sees Trotsky's writings and Trotsky's theory and thinks, oh, this is brilliant, I'm gonna become a Trotskyist. No, they only become Trotskyists because they don't like the Soviet Union. That is the real appeal of these movements. And it is especially offensive to us. Like, we do get fairly triggered by that sort of thing, because so often they even use the exact same kind of stuff that we get from the right-wingers all the time. Like, don't you know the Soviet Union had no democracy? Don't you know it was totalitarian? Don't you know they killed millions? Like, we get that from the right, and then we get the same kind of treatment from the anarchists. Now, again, I'm generalizing. Not all anarchists do that, but a lot of them do. So to me, that is the real reason for most of the fighting that happens between our movements. Now, my position is that we can work with anarchists if they just agree to not fuck with us. Don't talk shit about us constantly, and we can work with you. You don't have to agree, you can voice your disagreements, you can voice your concerns and whatnot, but don't spread lies and anti-communist propaganda about us, and then we can coexist peacefully. There's one anarchist comrade who I know, a musician. I'm an amateur musician myself, and he's an amateur musician also. We met in anti-fascist, musical circles, and we get along very well, because all he cares about is being anti-fascist. He doesn't spend all his time just talking about how horrible the Soviet Union was. He spends his time talking about how bad Nazism is. So we get along very well. The people who say that anarchists are not my comrades, you shouldn't generalize quite as much. If they're horrible, if they just attack us constantly, then yeah, sure, it's kind of difficult to work with them. But if they don't do that, if they're willing to be respectful towards us, then there's no real reason why we couldn't work with them. Then, what Badmouse said about how Marxist-Leninists think that ML is the only way forward and ML is the only correct way of doing things and nothing else can work. I'm guilty of doing that. I do that all the time. Maybe that can sound arrogant. Maybe we should specify a bit more, but how I see it is that obviously other kinds of systems can work. I'm not gonna rule it out. Venezuela is not Marxist-Leninist, but they've achieved some stuff. What we really mean when we say that Marxism-Leninism is the only way forward is that it's the best way forward. We think it's the most successful, we think it's the most capable of taking power, of resisting attacks from enemies, has the best theory. So we think it's the best way forward. However, I don't like the idea when there's some people who are very pluralistic-minded. They say everybody can have their own thing and do their own thing. The reason I don't like that is not because I'm an evil, totalitarian, proto-fascist or something who just wants to impose his will on everybody else. No, it's really because we think that this revolutionary process, this world revolution, is gonna be so fucking hard to do. Why would you try to win a war without an army? Why would you try? What is the point? Or if you want to build Christian socialism that's only based on the Bible and morality instead of real economic facts and stuff like that, that's better than capitalism, but that kind of stuff so obviously has a rather slim chance of success. Why would you? I hope that clarifies this a little bit. Titoists are people like this. They say what do you have to criticize Yugoslavia? Couldn't you just let them do their own thing? But no, I think that anarchism, Titoism, and other kind of market socialism and stuff like that, they are fundamentally so flawed that I don't have much confidence in their success. And that is not to say that Marxism-Leninism always works perfectly. Of course not. Like, obviously not. But we understand how difficult it's gonna be. Why would you not pick the option that's most likely to succeed? I think the people who say that we should just take it easy and everybody can do their own thing, they're greatly underestimating the enemy at this point. We don't have the luxury of taking it easy, you know.
When I came on the online sphere, and people were just like, "What's your ideology?" And I was just like, "What the hell are you talking about?" I'm not gonna say I'm one thing, because I'm like, this has some very good ideas, and this has some very good ideas. Like, what's the most practical, where I live, and like, what's ideal, and whatever.
I always label myself a Marxist-Leninist, and it is because of what I said earlier. Like, I just think that is the thing that has the best chance of success. But Mexie has a good point that we shouldn't limit ourselves. We shouldn't isolate ourselves from new ideas because of our current ideas. Which, of course, Marxism-Leninism ideally doesn't do that. Marxism-Leninism tries to be as scientific about what it does. It's not a set of doctrine that you have to just accept blindly. No, it's an analysis. And then you use that analysis and things change, you get different results using the analysis. Just like Engels said, Marxism is not a dogma, it's a guide to action. So we shouldn't be close-minded, we shouldn't isolate ourselves from new ideas. But I think, Mexie, that you're a bit mistaken if you think that being a Marxist-Leninist means that you have to limit yourself. Already, if you're a Marxist, it means you're not a capitalist, so you're kind of limiting yourself in that you don't want capitalism. And you're not an anarchist, so you're limiting yourself in that sense. Any kind of ideology, of course, it excludes something, but Marxism-Leninism is not so rigid and so, whatever. If you want a really simple and really short explanation of kinda how our mindset is, I think Mao's Where Do Correct Ideas Come From? Actually, there's a video about it on YouTube. I'm gonna put the link in the description. But that is very good, because it says, where do correct ideas come from? Do they fall from the sky? They come from practice and scientific experiment. You analyze the world, you come up with ideas, you put those ideas into practice. Whatever ideas don't work, you discard them. Whatever ideas work, you keep using them and refining them. That is scientific experiment. And some people think it's like super pretentious when we say Marxism is a science and whatnot. And it's funny, like the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism, but it's not a hard science as in physics or math or something. It's just the scientific approach, Where do correct ideas come from? Do they fall from the sky, or do they come from real material circumstances? That is a materialistic scientific approach. And the idea of a scientific experiment, that you see what works and what doesn't work, and then you try to do what works. So I think that Mexie has quite a Marxist-Leninist attitude towards this, which, is great. Even before I talked with Mexie, I think the first video by her I saw was like something to do with capitalism and ecology, and I thought like, wow, this is exactly the kind of stuff we want. The perspective of it was very, very clearly Marxist materialistic,
Yeah, that's why I'm saying like a one-size-fits-all would never work anyway, so it's always going to be context-specific.
The kind of one-size-fits-all approach, we have a term for it, it's called formalism. There's actually a speech by Kim Il-sung, something like opposing dogmatism and formalism. He starts the speech by saying that in this country we got two groups, two factions which are both kind of wrong. There's the people who really fetishize the Soviet Union and they want to copy the Soviet Union. And then there's another group who want to do the same thing, except for China. And he was saying, this is formalism and dogmatism. We can't do either one of those things. This is not the Soviet Union, this is not China, this is Korea, so we're gonna do things the Korean way. We gotta look at China, we gotta look at the Soviet Union, and we gotta come up with something of our own, based on that previous experience. We say Marxism-Leninism is universally applicable, so we say that it can be applied anywhere. But it certainly cannot be applied everywhere the same way. Core idea is going to be the same, but the application is going to be different.
Every country is going to have a different struggle because like in Canada, we would have to relocalize all of our manufacturing. Like
Right.
it would actually be a really big job
Exactly.
to be like, oh, everyone's jobs here are actually pretty much obsolete because we're all in the service business, and like we have to relocalize literally everything. So like our job would be way different than like someone else.
If any of these Western countries became socialist, there would have to be a heavy emphasis on self-sufficiency to a big degree. They do have mineral wealth. Finland doesn't have any oil, so we would have to import oil. But we do have valuable metals in the ground. We have lots of timber, those kinds of necessary things. And we do have a lot of farmland as well. And I think the UK does have enough farmland. I think most countries could be food self-sufficient if they needed to be. I actually looked into this some time ago that Finland would be food self-sufficient or could be, except for the fact that the fuel and the fertilizer and a bunch of those like pesticides or whatever you use, we have to get from other places. I think the energy sanctions would be the most difficult thing to deal with.
Even on the other side, like the extreme like ML like side is just also like, okay, I totally understand supporting and like, you know, trying to educate people about the USSR, whatever, China and all this stuff. But everything wasn't 100% perfect.
No, exactly.
Right? It's like, it's one thing to be like, okay, let's educate people to be like, okay, actually, like Stalin did this. He raised the life expectancy. He did all of this great stuff. But then there was this, right? Like, it's like you can't.
And I wonder maybe if people would like jam to that by being a bit more sort of two sides, maybe.
Right, because then like a centrist or a liberal would be like, oh, okay, and then you can also explain like, well, these were the circumstances that.
I entirely agree. And this is kind of like what I was saying about being cynical, because I think the reason why I wasn't ever disappointed with the Soviet system and stuff like that is because I never imagined it to be like a heaven on earth. I always knew that it was imperfect. So if you don't have these crazy unrealistic expectations, then you also won't be disappointed. Maybe there are people who imagined it to be better than it actually was, who view it more romantically than me, but I don't think anyone really thinks it was perfect. It's just that I think people become overtly defensive. We get attacked so much that then people kind of just go crazy in the other direction. They don't want to admit to anything bad. They don't want to acknowledge any problems. And, you know, this really is the difficulty about this, because it's so ideologically colored, because if you admit that there were problems, then the other side is immediately going to say, like, see, there were problems, therefore it was bad. This makes it difficult to have an honest discussion about anything. People are overtly defensive. I entirely understand why they are that way. And from personal experience, like, I can say that nowadays I'm much more critical of the Soviet Union than I was before. Which, I mean, some like ultra-lefts, they might think that's like laughable or ridiculous, but even though maybe to them what I'm saying doesn't sound any different, but internally at least, I'm more critical than I was before. Because when I got into this thing, I used to be a social democrat, then I became a Marxist, and I was very anti-Soviet. And then gradually I became more and more pro-Soviet. And then, like, after I realized how much just bullshit and lies and propaganda there was against the Soviet Union, practically everything they tell you is wrong. In that kind of a mindset, it becomes very easy to see any criticism as just lies. Because, like, if most of the criticism is lies or is based on lies, then you don't really see the nuance. But over time, I became more able to see, like, what is a valid criticism. So I think that has a lot to do with it as well. Like, some people are just at the stage where they've denounced all the anti-communist lies, but they haven't developed the nuance yet.
I don't know, I was never able to argue particularly well with anarchist economics. Like, when I've been talking to Jack Angstreich, or whatever his name is, the guy who had a brilliant debate.
He was so good. Amazing.
Like,
oh my fucking god, yeah.
Tell me what CV and S stands for.
I know, I was like, you did the
yeah. I read all 3 volumes of Capital.
Me and Garlic joked about this so fucking much.
I guess anarchism doesn't have any problem with, like, you know, bootmakers. Have you heard that argument?
I have no idea what you're saying.
Well, it's like Bakunin said, like, when it comes to who's making the boots, I listen to the bootmaker, that kind of thing.
Okay.
So, and I guess it's justified hierarchy, but then it comes to who justifies the hierarchy.
The way Marxism approaches this is extreme division of labor we see as alienating and bad. But instead of trying to abolish division of labor right now, we kind of approach it in a different way. Like, how do you get rid of the fact that you need political administrators and experts and stuff instead of just having the regular people do absolutely everything? How do you get around that? Well, our view is that you decrease the need and the scale and the level of technocracy by raising the educational and cultural level of the population as a whole, and you make the people more politically active and more politically conscious, and that way they can be more engaged in deciding things. That's how you sort of slowly decrease the need for this separate group of administrators. Not everyone can be a neurosurgeon or whatnot, but in a modern Western society, most people could probably be elected in like the town council or something. They're perfectly capable of that. Most people in a workplace could probably be some kind of administrators. Now, in Russia, that wasn't the case, of course, because if you're a peasant who can't even read, then you probably can't really manage things, you know. But just the idea that if you make everyone if you uplift everyone with education and stuff like that, then you can get the normal people more actively involved in politics, and you need less division of labor. I don't really agree with the bootmaker argument in the sense that I don't think there's any need to try to justify division of labor. We should accept that it exists now, but we should also take active measures to try to move forward away from that, because I don't think we need such a strict division of labor in the future. Like, there's gonna be like brain surgeons, but that doesn't have to have privilege and power associated with it. Similarly, politics doesn't need to have privilege and power associated with it. It will for a while, but not for all time.